Pardon me, Benedict. Benedict, are you still there?
Hold on for a second, Tom.
Okay, yeah, just tell me when I should begin.
Yes.
Thank you.
Gib mir ein Zeichen. Ja, guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Wir begrüßen Sie wieder zur Ringvorlesung an der Universität Erfurt im Wintersemester Jüdisch lernen, Konzepte und Medien der Bildung im und über das Judentum. Heute Abend, und Claudia Bergmann wird gleich noch unseren Redner heute Abend vorstellen. Heute Abend ist Tom Blanton der Vortragende und das ist für uns eine weitere Premiere. Tom Blanton, der aus Milwaukee heute Abend uns diese Vorlesung halten wird. Ich möchte noch zwei technische Dinge vorab klären. Einige von den Studentinnen und Studenten der Universität, die diese Vorlesung als Lehrveranstaltung belegt haben, haben schon nachgefragt, wie das mit der Klausur aussehen wird. Am 8. Dezember haben wir eine dieser Einheiten reserviert, um über alle Fragen sprechen zu können, die die Klausur betreffen. Ich kann Ihnen aber jetzt schon sagen, wir werden entweder am 16. Februar oder am 22. Februar die Klausur schreiben. Und zwar, so haben wir das geplant, in einem digitalen Format. Das kennen einige von Ihnen schon aus dem vergangenen Sommersemester. Das werden wir Ihnen später noch erklären. Es wird vermutlich so sein, aber auch das werden wir am 8. Dezember erklären, dass Sie mehrere kleinere Aufgaben bekommen, die Sie beantworten werden, die sich auf verschiedene Vorlesungen, die im Laufe des Semesters zu hören waren, beziehen werden. Also Sie brauchen nicht mehr zu schreiben, entweder am 16.02. Dann, wenn die Pandemie so weiter verlaufen wird, dass wir mit Jascha Nemzow nicht in Präsenz uns treffen können. Wenn das aber möglich sein sollte, dann wird die Vorlesung eine Woche später stattfinden. Das Zweite, auch heute Abend, das richtet sich jetzt an alle, auch diejenigen, die nicht Studierende der Universität Erfurt sind. Auch heute Abend haben Sie wieder die Möglichkeit, Fragen zu stellen nach der Vorlesung. Bitte schicken Sie die wieder an meine E-Mail-Adresse. Ich sage sie noch einmal, benedikt.kranemann@uni-erfurt.de. benedikt.kranemann@uni-erfurt.de. Das hat letzte Woche wunderbar geklappt. Sie können die Fragen in englischer Sprache oder in deutscher Sprache schicken und wir werden sie, wenn sie in deutscher Sprache geschickt werden, an Tom Blanton übersetzen. Wir freuen uns, dass wieder viele von Ihnen heute Abend hier zuhören und zuschauen. Und ich bitte jetzt Claudia Bergmann, Tom Blanton vorzustellen und kurz in die Vorlesung einzuführen. Claudia.
Guten Abend auch von meiner Seite. Schön, dass Sie alle wieder dabei sind. Ob Sie alle dabei sind, weiß ich natürlich nicht. Ich sehe ja nur mich selbst hier auf dem Screen. Aber beim letzten Mal, weiß ich, waren viele von Ihnen da und haben auch viele Fragen gestellt. Schön, dass Sie wieder da sind. Ich habe jetzt die Freude, meinen Kollegen, den Neutestamentler Tom Blanton, vorzustellen. Er sitzt in Milwaukee in den USA und ist uns zugeschaltet. Es ist 11 Uhr früh bei ihm heute Morgen und er wird uns seine Vorlesung in englischer Sprache halten. Tom Blanton hat seine Dissertation an der Divinity School of the University of Chicago geschrieben und hat sein PhD im Fach Biblical Studies erhalten. Er ist gegenwärtig Associate Fellow am Max-Weber-Kolleg der Universität Erfurt. Tom Blanton hat 5 Bücher geschrieben oder herausgegeben und sein neuestes oder sein wichtigstes ist A Spiritual Economy, Gift Exchange in the Letters of Paul of Tarsus. Sein Forschungsinteresse liegt im Bereich des frühen Christentums und des Wirtschaftswesens im frühen Christentum und auch in der Beziehung von frühen Christentum und frühen Judentum. Tom Blanton kennt sich aus mit dem Lehren und dem Lernen, auch persönlich. Er hat College-Studenten unterrichtet an der St. Xavier University und dem Luther College in den Vereinigten Staaten. Er hat auch auf dem Masters-Niveau unterrichtet, und zwar an der University of Notre Dame und an der Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago, sowie an der Graham School of Continuing Studies in Chicago. Und er wollte, dass ich Ihnen auch noch was Persönliches von ihm erzähle, nämlich, dass er seinem kleinen Sohn schon im Vorschulalter das Lesen beigebracht hat. Also wir haben einen Experten des Lehrens und Lernens bei uns und freuen uns jetzt auf deinen Vortrag, Tom. We're looking forward to your presentation, and whenever you're ready, you can start.
Thank you, Claudia, for your very kind introduction. And let me thank both Claudia and Benedict Kronemann for inviting me to give a lecture on education in the New Testament and early Christian literature today. It is my great pleasure to be able to participate in the Ringvorlesung virtually from the US this evening for you. So we begin. First, I give an overview of the points that we will discuss today. The first point that we'll look at is to give an overview of education in Greek and Roman contexts. Then we will move to look at education in Jewish contexts. Thirdly, we will look at education specifically in the New Testament and some early Christian literature, and we will pay special attention to two figures, Jesus and Paul. Next, we will look at a shift that takes place from the middle of the first to the beginning of the second century CE in early Christian teaching. It initially addresses adults, and then it moves to later addressing entire households, including children. And then finally, I will give a summary of the main points and conclude. If you take a look at the slide here that we have on the right side of the screen, we have an image of what appears to be a young couple. This image is from Pompeii in the first century of the Common Era. And this young couple is advertising their wealth and prestige, first and foremost, by the fact that they could afford to have a portrait painted. That was somewhat costly to do in antiquity. But more to the point for our purposes, they are signaling their prestige in terms of their literacy. You can see that the female figure on our left is holding in her hand a wax writing tablet, and we'll take a closer look at a writing tablet later. And in her right hand, she is holding a stylus that would be used to write or inscribe letters on the tablet. The figure on the right may be her husband, and this figure is also signaling his literacy. He is holding in his right hand a rolled up scroll, indicating either his ability to read or to write or both. So here, this indicates that it could be viewed as a point of prestige and pride if you could read in antiquity. We address now the question of literacy rates in antiquity, and here concerning from about the 4th century BCE, or before the Common Era, to around the 3rd century CE, or of the Common Era. In an influential book, William V. Harris argued that the literacy rate in antiquity during this period would not have been greater than 10 to 15%. That is, about 10 to 15% of people would have been able to read and write. However, there were some differences between groups and between regions that we can observe. That is, the wealthier classes, the ruling classes, the aristocracy, had a far higher literacy rate than non-elites, non-aristocratic figures, and also urban contexts, because of a higher concentration of aristocratic figures, also had higher literacy rates than rural contexts. Because the majority of the population in antiquity lived in rural environments, this skewed the overall literacy rate downward to the 10 to 15% that Harris identifies. We can then look at the three different levels of ancient education, three different tiers of education. The first and simplest level was that of primary instruction. At this level, the student would learn the alphabet. They would practice for maybe a year or even 2 years, simply writing the letters, copying the letters, and doing this mechanically. There is some evidence that some scribes who were employed as professional scribes had only this level of literacy because of mistakes that they make in copying and writing. Some scholars have argued that some scribes actually did not know what they were writing. They were simply copying letters. And this was the most basic phase of ancient literacy. The second thing that would take place in the phase of primary instruction was learning to sound out the letters, learning to put them together into syllables, and therefore basic reading, and also basic arithmetic. Moving upward slightly to the level of secondary instruction, reading and interpretation of poetic texts like Homer took place at this stage, and also the instruction of geometry. And then the highest level was that of the tertiary or rhetorical instruction. At this level, we would only expect to encounter aristocrats. People who weren't quite as wealthy may have been able to afford a primary or secondary instruction in many cases, although, caveat, this is not more than 10 to 15% of the population total. But so moving into this last area of tertiary or rhetorical instruction, this was only really the aristocratic group that could afford this. At this stage, the focus would be on prose works and the composition of discourses. This was to prepare the aristocratic figures for public life, to prepare them for giving speeches in the Senate during the Roman period, to prepare them to debate and to make laws, to engage in philosophy or in oratory on a public stage. And then we can look next at the roles and positions in education. In Dr. Bergman's lecture last week, she referred to this as the Personen in education. And we begin by talking about the students. We could expect in general that students from about the age of 7 years old to about 18 years old would be engaged in education, although this could vary. A student could begin slightly earlier, and people could certainly begin much later than this. Older students helped younger students in their education. They would help them with homework, and they would help them with instruction in class during the day. This indicates that that there is some fluidity between the different levels of education. Primary and secondary students were often meeting in the same location at the same time. So we shouldn't view these so much as discrete levels of education that were really separated. There was overlap and fluidity between these different levels. Another figure associated with education in antiquity is the pedagogue, or in Greek, the paidagogos. The pedagogue was a slave who accompanied the student to and from school, who helped the student with their homework. And if they got done with their homework, then the pedagogue may assign them additional homework. And the pedagogue also served as a moral advisor. And this was especially important in cases when the student had to leave their hometown to go and pursue their education in a different city, as sometimes happens. In that case, the pedagogue basically served in place of a parent as moral advisor. And then lastly, we can take a look at the teachers. The teachers were to some degree divided along the three different levels of education. That is, there was an elementary instructor for the first level, a grammarian for the second level, and a rhetor, or teacher of public speaking, for the third level. Although the teachers could certainly have taught on more than one level, and in some cases, as we've seen, there would be students from different levels in the same classroom taught by a single teacher. Now we take a look at some images. These images come from Athens from about 490 to 480 BCE. Oh, excuse me. I have just... I apologize. I have, by accident, exited my keynote presentation. Let me find out how to get this back. If I may take a 2-minute pause, if Claudia and Benedict could bear with me here for one moment, I need to get my PowerPoint image back up. Okay. Now, Claudia and Benedict, can you see my screen again? Am I sharing or no?
We can't see anything yet, Tom.
You can't see it?
No, not yet.
Okay.
Wir bitten um etwas Geduld. Wir kriegen das hin.
Let me share again. It should be coming. Yes.
We can see your PowerPoint, Tom, but you are not visible yet.
This is curious. Okay. I may have turned off the video. Okay, I'm back.
You're back.
Now, can you tell me, you see an image now of, a black and orange image, yes?
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. My apologies for that technical error. So we see an image here from antiquity, from the Greek period, the Greek education, and the images, I think, tell us a lot to go along with what we can learn from text, but also they can give us a better feel of what was taking place in educational context in antiquity. We can see here, there is a figure on the right, a bearded figure, who is also seated. This was the teacher of the classroom, and he was seated on a chair called a thronos, a throne. His seated posture indicates a status here and a position of authority. Moving to his left, from our perspective, we have a young student who is standing in front of another figure. And this figure could either be an older student who is helping the younger student with his work, or it could be a hypodidaskalos, an under teacher or a teacher's aide who had gone through his curriculum entirely and then was promoted to becoming a teacher under the supervision of the elder teacher here. We can see that that this hypodidaskalos, this under teacher, has a wax writing tablet open. To us today, it may look somewhat like a laptop computer. It was not. And he is holding in his right hand a stylus so that he could check or perhaps write into the wax that would be on this stylus letters and words and texts. Moving over to the left more, it appears to be the same student here in this scene, and perhaps also the same hypodidaskalos, under teacher. And here the student is being taught music. And you can see that the teacher is teaching him how to play a sort of flute. And also above the student's head is pictured another musical instrument. This is a stringed musical instrument. From this, we learn that in antiquity, education was not simply about learning to read and write and do arithmetic. It was also about learning music. And not pictured here was another important aspect of education in the Greek context, and that is physical education. Learning to run and jump and box and wrestle were all important parts of education in the Greek context. We look down below to the second image, and we can see again here on the right, we have the elder teacher who is supervising the teaching that's taking place. And you can see what may be the same character here, the same teacher or a different teacher. It's unclear to me which this is, but at any rate, he's holding up a scroll so that the student can practice his reading. And then moving to the left, you see instruction taking place in the stringed musical instrument. And this is the first image that we have seen in which the student is seated like the teacher. In the other images, the student is standing and the teacher is seated. So there is an authority structure that is encoded here in the postures that are assumed by the teacher and by the student. Learning to read in antiquity involved first an extensive time of practicing simply writing the letters. And we're talking about mechanically copying the letters, not necessarily at the beginning, even being able to read those letters or even knowing exactly what you are copying in terms of what it meant. And we can see in antiquity that there were written in various places ancient exercises in learning to read, in which the students would copy out not only single letters or texts, but they would copy out syllables. So, for example, ba, be, bi, bo. And the students, we know, would learn before they could read outright. They would practice reading out specific syllables like this. And then if we look at the image on the right side of the screen, this is a writing tablet from Egypt in the Byzantine period. And on the top here, we have in Greek an inscription that is translated, "Letters are the greatest beginning of understanding." And the teacher has written this bit, and you can see that the hand here is fairly fluid, flowing, and a practiced hand. So this is the teacher writing, and has had many years to hone his skills in writing letters. Just below this, the teacher has signed his name, and then below this wavy line, the student is asked to copy the letters that the teacher has written. And so you can see a big difference between the letters that the student is writing and the letters that the teacher has written up above. And so the student is copying these in two different columns here. And so we would be looking at here at our typical writing assignments that would be for a primary student. Another aspect of antique education, one that students today will probably be happy is no longer around, or at least not to the same extent that it was in antiquity, is the element of corporal punishment. In antiquity, there was a prevalent idea that students would not learn unless they were beaten, if they were not paying attention or had not learned their lesson adequately. And I've just gathered here 3 different sayings from 3 different contexts in ancient education. The first comes from ancient Pharaonic Egypt, and there was a maxim written on a papyrus sheet, and the maxim says, "The ears of a youth are on his back. He listens when he is beaten." So in case someone is not paying attention, they are drifting off, their mind is elsewhere than on task, then it was commonplace across antiquity for the teacher to beat the student. Moving ahead in time to 4th century BCE, and the poet Menander, the poet wrote, "He who is not beaten cannot be educated." And we have found this little saying copied on a roll of papyrus by a student in the Roman period. And we could perhaps imagine the context in which this may have taken place in antiquity. You could imagine a student who perhaps had drifted off and his mind was wandering, and then may have been actually beaten by the teacher, and then, to add insult to injury, was asked to copy this to reinforce the punishment, not only physically but mentally, and to copy this maxim over and over. And then finally, we see written on the wall of a house in Roman Pompeii, and this was a household in which the youth in the house were apparently being educated by a private tutor. And the tutor has written on the wall, "If you do not like Cicero, you will be whipped." Cicero was a stock of a Roman education. So if you are the student and you perhaps do not like Cicero, you definitely should not let your teacher know about that. We take a look now at a Hellenistic period vase, and on the top left side, we have an image of a female teacher who is called a deskale, which is an abbreviated form of didaskale, the feminine form of didaskalos, for any of you who may know some Greek. And you can see to her right, there is a young student here who appears to be trying to pull away from the teacher, although she is grasping the student by the arms. And in her left hand, she is holding what is actually her sandal. It was common for teachers to take off their sandals, apparently, and to beat students with them. In addition to being beaten by a sandal, the student could perhaps expect to be beaten by a leather strap or whip, or a rod made from a stalk of fennel, or even in some cases, the teacher may simply remove the cap from their head and beat the student with it. Raffaele Cribiore, in an influential study, observes that 8 out of 87 references to teachers in Egyptian papyri are women teachers. So the rate would be about 9% of teachers referred to in Egyptian papyri were women. And we have, moving back to the image on the left here, we have another scene on the bottom of a female teacher that's seated on a very nice chair or throne here. And she is surrounded by students. You can see a female student here who is reading aloud from an open scroll. And then on the other side, we have another student who appears to be playing a musical instrument. And then behind her, still another student who has her writing tablet open. In the contemporary period, we think of schools as connected to a particular structure, to a particular physical structure, that is a particular building or set of buildings. And schools today, we can expect to endure over decades or centuries. But in antiquity, it was not so. There was not, generally speaking, a specific building in which education took place, although there were gymnasiums in which education took place, but that was not the only place that school could have been held. In antiquity, to some extent, rather than being connected with a building, the school was, in many cases, simply the teacher, him or herself. And the teacher could move about. Rather than being in one particular place, the teacher could occupy a private or a public building. And we know some examples of that, and we'll look at some in coming slides. However, a school could also be located within the perimeter of an ancient temple, in the cell of a monastery in late antiquity, in a private house, or even in the open air, at a street corner or under a tree. And some ancient writers remark on the difficulty that students and teachers might have when concentrating. And you can imagine if school was being held on a street corner near a marketplace, for example, where people were buying and selling goods, people were shouting, people were running and bustling about. And in some corner tucked away was a teacher and some students trying to focus on their exercises. This was not an easy situation for education to take place. And we know in antiquity that teachers would sometimes move about from village to village or from a village to a larger city to try and seek better opportunities and more students. The teacher was paid per student. Now we move to look at Jewish education and literacy in antiquity. We know that the basic mechanics of Jewish education in antiquity were similar to those that we have seen before. There were probably different levels of education that almost certainly started with learning the alphabet and learning what the different letters sounded like, and then later learning to read texts. However, when we are talking about Jewish education, we have far less evidence than we do for Greco-Roman education, so we don't know as much as we would like about the Jewish context. One thing that seems fairly certain, however, as Chris Keith points out, and this is a majority view, is that like the rest of the ancient world, the literacy rate in Second Temple Judaism was low. We can expect probably 10 to 15% or perhaps even less. Probably. although most scholars don't want to try and assign specific numbers. What we really know is that the literacy rate was low. Catherine Hesser writes, in the first 2 centuries of the Common Era, when there were few opportunities for elementary education outside the home, children's basic instruction in the Torah would have been restricted to certain educated circles. And 2 things are notable in this statement. First, that certain educated circles were the ones who were receiving the bulk of the education in antiquity. And we've seen already in the Greco-Roman world, it was the aristocrats who were receiving at least the highest levels of education. And something else that can strike us about this statement is that his children's instruction was in the Torah. And as Professor Bergman has noted in her very fine Vorlesung last week, the Torah means simply instruction in Hebrew, but it comes in the Greco-Roman period to refer to the Pentateuch, that is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, which were understood to be the books of Moses, the Torah, the law. And now we can look a little bit more at who these educated circles were that Catherine Hesser refers to. The educated circles would include the temple priesthood and their families. They would include the ruling classes, the aristocrats. They would include also, at a slightly lower level, scribes and teachers who were in the retainer class. That is, people who were working for the temple priests and the aristocrats as middle management bureaucrats. And in these contexts, there are a lot of references to fathers teaching their sons to read. In one example from the Testament of Levi, which was a document written in Aramaic in the 3rd or 2nd century BCE, we read the following statement: "Teach your children letters, so that they may have understanding, reading unceasingly the law of God." So we can see from this that teaching in letters was the basic starting point for education in Jewish education, as it was in Greco-Roman. And again, as corresponding with what Catherine Hesser said, they are taught to read specifically the law of God, the Torah. The education here, unlike what we've seen before, education in Greek or Greek and Latin, here the education that would have been taking place in Aramaic, because we can see this because the text itself is written in Aramaic, and that was one of the common languages around the turn of the era. But also the law of God here, the Torah, was written in Hebrew. This means that there was bilingual instruction in both Aramaic and Hebrew taking place in the context that's presupposed by this text. And we should point out that the Testament of Levi depicts the biblical figure Levi as telling his children that they should teach their children letters. Levi and his children were understood to be priests. So this is a priestly context that we are talking about here. Finally, Catherine Hesser points out that opportunities that were limited in the Greco-Roman period may have increased in the 3rd and 4th centuries of the Common Era, because a later literature in the Mishnah and then later still in the Talmud depicts a more developed educational system in Jewish literature than we see in the Greco-Roman period. We now take a look at 2 Jewish teachers, and we can compare and contrast these 2. This is Ben Sira and Philo of Alexandria. First, Ben Sira. Ben Sira was a Jewish teacher active in Jerusalem in the 190s and 180s BCE, and probably before and after that. Ben Sira wrote in Hebrew and studied scriptures in Hebrew, and had a school in which students would come perhaps to his home and study with him. So they were reading and studying scriptures in Hebrew. We can contrast that a bit with Philo of Alexandria, who was a Jewish teacher who had his own school in Egypt. But unlike Ben Sira, Philo was reading scriptures in Greek. He was reading the Torah, the Pentateuch, the books of Moses, in a Greek version, which we would call the Septuagint today. He had his own private library that had not only Jewish texts, but also probably Greco-Roman texts like Plato and other Greek philosophers. And Philo quotes not only scripture extensively, not only Torah, but he also quotes Platonic philosophers. He seems to know a very great deal about Greek and Stoic philosophy, and is very well read in Greek literature. So we can infer from this that he has an excellent tertiary and more rhetorical and philosophical education in a fully Greek mode. And so here we have some interesting differences and similarities between two teachers, one in Judea, in Jerusalem, and one outside of Judea in Egypt. Ben Sira also gives us some interesting comments about how he views the social role and the social location of the wise man or the sage, the Jewish teacher. Ben Sira says that the wisdom of the scribe depends on the opportunity of leisure. Only the one who has little business can become wise. And here the wisdom of the scribe, the scribal figure, is a teacher figure, and Ben Sira would count himself as one of these. He says that the only way to become wise in his sense is to have leisure time. And then he goes on to contrast the scribe who has leisure with the other kinds of workers and craftsmen who do not. The potters, blacksmiths, and farmers, Ben Sira mentions, these people spend all of their time at work. They do not have time to study. He says, although he appreciates their great skill in what they do, and he says they even uphold the world, society cannot function without them, he says, nevertheless, they are not sought out for the counsel of the people, nor do they attain eminence in the public assembly. They do not sit in the judge's seat, and they are not found among the rulers. So in a kind of elitist perspective, Ben Sira has a hierarchical view of society in which the craftsmen are somewhat lower on the hierarchy than the scribe, the sage, like Ben Sira himself. But on the other hand, Ben Sira is conscious that although the scribe may be found among the rulers, he himself is not one of the rulers. So there is a self-consciousness here that the sage is in the retainer class, working for the ruling class. Now we move to look at the New Testament and early Christian literature. And I sent to Dr. Bergman a link to the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which I hope you will have had a chance to take a look at. If not, you can take a look at it later. We take a look at this first, not because it is earliest among the Christian texts, but because it is one of the early texts that deals head-on with questions of education. This text was probably written in the middle or late 2nd century CE. And in case you were worried that the young Jesus was really as terrible as this narrative depicts, never fear. This is very much a novelistic and fictive portrayal of the young Jesus. Jesus in the text is portrayed as a kind of Wunderkind. He has supernatural powers. He is able to kill people. He is able to harm or maim them, but he is also able to heal them if he wishes. He also has advanced and somewhat esoteric or secret knowledge from a very young age, before he has received any instruction at all from any teacher. We can see some elements of verisimilitude, that is, history-like references in the text. For example, in this narrative, the young Jesus goes to school. His father wants him to learn to read. This coheres with what we otherwise know about ancient education. It was typically the young children who would begin to go to school. A second element that we can connect to antiquity is that Jesus' father hires a private tutor to teach Jesus. We know that sometimes wealthy aristocrats hired private tutors to come into their homes and to teach the students. However, we would not expect someone who is a carpenter, as Jesus' father is depicted in the text, to have enough money to be able to hire a private tutor to come into the home. So this is not exactly what we would expect in antiquity. But another aspect that we would expect to take place would be that the teacher starts with letters. The education starts with letters, learning to name the letters and to recognize the letters, and then finally to know what the letters sounded like. Some fictive elements that we can see, however, in the narrative is that the young student puts the teacher to shame rather than just the opposite. There is a reversal in the power structure in this narrative. We have seen that the typical situation is that the teacher is hierarchically situated above the student in terms of power and authority. The teacher can put the student to shame if the student is not paying attention. If they haven't learned their lesson, they could be beaten or asked to copy out what could be humiliating statements about how it is necessary to punish students. However, in the infancy gospel, the roles are reversed. It is actually the student who has all the power, who is holding all the cards, and the student puts the teacher to shame by knowing way more than the teacher knows. And if we look at the image here on the right side of the screen, we have a better image than we have seen so far of a Roman period wax tablet. You can see that we have here various wooden tablets that are stitched together so that if you would hold them from our perspective sideways, if we were to rotate this along the other axis and then hold it up, it would appear, if you had this in your lap or if you were holding it, it would appear to be something like a contemporary laptop. And that's why we have seen some images previously with students and teachers appearing to hold something like a laptop in their hands. But this is a more close-up view of what this was. And you can see here the black material that is adhering to the surface of the tablet. This was a wax material, and the student could take the stylus and inscribe the letters and the texts into the wax, and they would remain there until you needed to use this same page again. You could simply wipe this clean. You could wipe out the letters, and then you could start over and use it again. Now we look at Jesus as an adult and look at a more historical perspective on Jesus than the one that we saw in the infancy narrative. Jesus was known as Rabbi according to the Gospels in the New Testament and outside of it. Rabbi is a Hebrew term that means my teacher or my great one. And he gathered around him, according to the sources, a group of disciples. And this term in Greek also means learners or students. The disciples were the students. Jesus, however, was not teaching his students how to read and write like the other teachers that we have seen so far. He was rather teaching them something a bit different. That was a mixture of Jewish wisdom. And in antiquity, wisdom typically was advice for everyday living. How to deal with circumstances that you are likely to encounter or problems that you are likely to encounter. This was ancient wisdom. Jesus was a wisdom teacher. In addition, he was teaching about interpreting Jewish traditions, including scriptural traditions. He was also teaching that the end is near. That is, he had an apocalyptic worldview and was teaching about that. The way that the Gospels portray this is that Jesus was preaching that the kingdom of God has come near. And we may point out finally that this teaching was oral and not written, as we have seen in the cases of the other teachers so far. There are debates about the literacy level of Jesus and Paul. Jesus was probably a craftsman or carpenter, a tekton in Greek, according to the Gospel of Mark. If this is correct, and it probably was, most scholars think that it was correct, then he would fall into the category of largely unlearned people described by Ben Sira. We can remember that Ben Sira says if you have a job as a craftsman, then you simply don't have time to engage in learning to the extent that someone like Ben Sira could engage in that. However, some craftsmen were able to get either a primary or maybe a primary and secondary education. This would depend on basically how wealthy their family was. If their father could earn a little extra money, then he could put that away and then use that for the son's education or perhaps the daughter's education. So some craftsmen did have basic literacy, but aside from having literacy taught to them by a teacher, there was also another avenue that you could become literate. There were apprenticeships for some professions in which the young boy would go away from home as an apprentice to learn a particular trade. And some trades required basic literacy and ability to do some arithmetic. And you can see the practical application of this. For example, if you need to get paid or if you need to pay someone, you need to be able to do some basic math. And we know from Sepphoris and other places in antiquity that sometimes builders would write out simple instructions for the workers about how to construct particular kinds of buildings. So this would require some basic literacy. But education did not stop in antiquity simply with the learning to read and write. One of the biggest venues that we know about for Jewish education was in the synagogue in antiquity, where every Sabbath in the synagogue, the Torah would be read and interpreted. So Jesus would have been able to attend his local synagogue on the Sabbath and to learn about traditions and interpretations of Jewish scripture. This may have been a very important avenue of education for the majority of Jewish people in antiquity. Now we take a look at Paul of Tarsus, who is writing letters to early Christian groups in around the middle of the first century of the Common Era. Paul was literate to some extent. To what extent is debated, and perhaps we can talk about it a bit more during the question and answer section later. He is familiar with motifs from education. For example, he likens the Torah to a pedagogue who teaches moral instruction. So this was a familiar figure from ancient education. In Romans 2, Paul addresses an imaginary Jewish teacher who is said to be instructed in the Torah and a teacher of children. And so here, this would cohere with the kind of Jewish education that we otherwise know about. Jewish teacher being instructed in Torah and teaching children letters and reading about the Torah and readings of the Torah. If we take a look at the image on the right here, we can see a terracotta image of a pedagogue who would have been a slave, as we have mentioned before, and he is holding his right hand around a very young student, and he is apparently shepherding this student, taking him to school. And you can see that the pedagogue is holding in his left hand what you may recognize as the stringed musical instrument that we have seen in some of the previous images. The pedagogue here is a male figure. We can see this primarily because of his big, full beard, and he is middle-aged or older, and we can see this because he is losing his hair on the top of his head, although he retains it on the sides. So this would probably be a typical image of a middle-aged or older slave taking a child to school. We see quite frequently teaching motifs used in early Christian instruction. However, there are also some shifts that take place relative to what we have seen so far today. The early Christian texts often use teaching language to refer not to actual situations of teachers teaching students their letters and teaching them to learn to read, but rather it refers to teachers who are instructing groups about Christian rituals and ideas. We can see a very nice example of this in the letter to the Hebrews, which is written sometime in the second half of the first century of the Common Era, perhaps between 60 and 100 of the Common Era. And the text reads, "For though by this time you ought to be teachers, didaskaloi, you need someone to teach you again the basic elements of the oracles of God." And then these are specified to include repentance, faith towards God, instruction about baptism, rituals of laying on of hands, the resurrection of the dead, and eternal judgment at the time of the apocalypse. So we can see here a couple of shifts taking place. Number one is that the teacher is no longer specifically someone who is teaching children to read and to write, but rather this is specifically a Christian teacher teaching Christian ideas. And the second transformation that we can see here taking place is that the basic elements, in Greek, the stoicheia, in a Greco-Roman education, the basic elements would, of course, be referring to the alphabet and to syllables, the basic elements from which writing and discourses are constructed. But the basic elements here refer to basic instruction about repentance and so on. that the Christian teacher would be transmitting to the audience. We see another shift taking place over time in the early Christian literature. In the middle of the 1st century CE, in the letters of Paul, it is pretty likely that only adults are being referred to as addressees of the letters, and only adults are meeting in the meetings of the early Christian groups that Paul was connected with. When Paul gives advice, it is advice about marriage and about lawsuits and other adult concerns. He does not give advice that pertains specifically to children. They do not seem to have been present in Paul's audiences. So this means that the first Christian groups and the instruction that was taking place was adult instruction. We can see again in the letter to the Hebrews, you have a similar situation. Hebrews 12:5 says, "And you have forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as children." And here, this line only makes sense if the people being addressed are adults. They are being addressed as children, in Greek, hos, in German, wie children. Therefore, they are not themselves children, but they are being addressed like children. And then the text goes on to cite Proverbs 3, which reads, "My child, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, or lose heart when you are punished by him. For the Lord disciplines those whom he loves, and chastises every child whom he accepts." And you will recall that last week, Dr. Bergman has talked about this context in which discipline and instruction was carried out in connection with education in the Jewish household, typically by the father. And so here we see this Hebrew Bible motif making its way into the early Christian text and being applied specifically to early Christian teaching. However, we can see a shift that takes place over time. By the late 1st century or early 2nd century of the Common Era, we can see some texts in which entire households, including children, could be viewed as subject to Christian instruction. And we consider here what's called the Deutero-Pauline literature. There are several letters in the New Testament that claim to be written by Paul, but they differ from the letters that are typically held to be genuinely written by Paul. They differ in terms of the Greek, the syntax and the grammar, and also the theology that is espoused in the text. And they seem to reflect a slightly later time period and are apparently written by later students who are imitating Paul's style and ideas. And these letters include Ephesians, probably Colossians, and 1 Timothy. And we take only one example from Ephesians that says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." And here the Lord may refer to the God of Israel, but later in the text, the Lord specifically refers to Jesus. And in the context of the surrounding material in this letter, clearly Christian teaching is being referred to here. And the early Christian groups would not make a hard and fast distinction between the Lord being the God of Israel and the Lord Jesus. If you were going to teach about one from the early Christian perspective, you would also be teaching about the other because they are closely linked. So we can see here the transformation of motifs of discipline and instruction in the household being applied specifically to the youth that were being instructed in Christian ideas here. Now, in closing, we simply summarize the main points. We have looked at the basic structure and methods of Greco-Roman education in this presentation, and we have also taken a look at Jewish education and seen that in some respects it was similar to Greco-Roman education in the sense that one would begin by learning the alphabet and then slowly learn to read. However, we've also seen that there are differences. The differences were typically based on region. In Judea or Jerusalem, the language of instruction would have been Hebrew or Hebrew and Aramaic. Outside of Judea, as with Philo, the language of instruction was Greek. But in both cases, it was the Torah, scriptural texts that are being read. We've also seen that early Christian texts incorporate education motifs to indicate Jesus' intellectual development as a child in the infancy gospel, but also in other material to refer to the basics of Christian ideas and rituals. And finally, we've seen a shift from adult-based education in Paul's letters to more household-based education in the Deutero-Pauline letters, and here including children. And I have also on the final slide, which is apparently on your Moodle site, given some examples of literature that would be a starting point if you're interested in pursuing any of these questions in more detail. Thank you very much.
Tom, we thank you for your instructive lecture. Thank you very much also for the images you chose for us. Lovely. And this is a time for the students to ask questions. So please bear with us a little bit until we have them here on the email.
Yes.
Vielen Dank fürs Zuhören, liebe Studierende. Ich hoffe, Sie können mich jetzt hören. Bitte schicken Sie Ihre Fragen zum Vortrag von Dr. Blanton an Professor Kranemann. Und bevor die bei uns ankommen, habe ich selber noch zwei Fragen und eine Sache, die ich Ihnen gern erklären möchte. Dr. Blanton hat die Begriffe BCE, BCE und CE, CE benutzt. Das sind die modernen Begriffe vor unserer Zeit und unserer Zeit, die ich auch beim letzten Mal schon erwähnt habe. Before Common Era auf Englisch oder Common Era auf Englisch. Die Begriffe BC, BC, vor Christus, Before Christ oder AD, AD, nach Christus, Anno Domini benutzt man nicht mehr in Religionswissenschaften und auch in im Neuen Testament nicht mehr. Also in der neutestamentlichen Wissenschaft nicht mehr. Meine eigene erste Frage, da geht es um die Darstellung von diesen Schulszenen, die wir ganz am Anfang gesehen haben. Meine Frage ist, warum wurde sowas überhaupt auf Vasen oder Tellern dargestellt? Tom, my first question to you before the students' questions arrive. You showed this very interesting image of a vase or a plate with school scenes. Maybe if you could call that up one more time. I was wondering, why would that be depicted on a vase or a plate, or what was the purpose of this? Is this just something that you show everyday life, or what was the purpose?
Yes, I think probably the purpose was twofold. A scene from everyday life, but also one of the main functions of education in antiquity was, especially at the tertiary level, the level of elite education, it was indicating your socio-political status in antiquity. If you could indicate in some way that you were educated, then this shows that you have some status in antiquity. So having a vase or having a drinking cup it displayed in your home would be advertising your own connection to education. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And my second question would be, also zuerst auf Deutsch, was waren denn die Kosten für Bildung in der Zeit, die Dr. Blanton besprochen hat? How much did one have to pay in order to get their child educated on the 3 levels that you discussed? Is that known?
Yes, it is known, and I looked this up. There is a text called the Price Edict of Diocletian that was written in 301 CE, Common Era. And in it, Diocletian and other emperors stipulated maximum prices that you could charge for a bunch of goods and services. And they indicated the prices that would typically be paid, or maximum prices that could be paid for teachers at various levels. And so the primary teacher received less money than the secondary teacher and the rhetor. And teachers who would be teaching particular subjects could also be paid more. So for example, the geometry teacher would be paid more than the primary education instructor. And how much specifically were they getting? The secondary instructor, the grammatical level, was getting 50 denarii per month per student. And there had been a lot of inflation that had taken place prior to this, but it would amount to 50 denarii would amount to the daily wage that a skilled craftsman like a carpenter or like a stonemason would make. This means that if the teacher wanted to make as much money as a skilled craftsman, he had to have at least 30 students. If you had more students than that, you could earn more. If you had only 15, then you would be making half of that of the amount of a stonemason. This would put you making about as much as a farm laborer or a mule driver. So this would knock you down in your social and economic status quite a bit. So I appreciate that question.
And thanks for your answer. Tom, if you could turn your PowerPoint off so that there are just 2 images on the screen, can you do that for the remainder of the questions?
Yes. Has it worked? Is it gone?
Has it worked, Professor Kranemann? Hat's funktioniert? Sind nur noch wir 2 drauf?
Okay, how about this?
Excellent. It worked. Thanks. The following questions are actually written by students to you in English, so I'm just going to read them off the page. You made it. Sie haben mir das sehr leicht gemacht heute. Vielen Dank. Erste Frage. First question. In antiquity, to what extent was being able to study not only limited by money, but also by ethnicity? Were there cases of communities that were more or less ethnically mixed?
Yeah, this is a good question. The primary limitation would certainly have been money. If you had money, regardless of your ethnicity, you could pay for education. Although, depending on where you lived, you may not have a teacher in your local region. For example, if you lived in a small village, you may have to send your son or daughter off to a different village or off to a bigger city to be educated. And this would be part of the function of the pedagogos. The pedagogue would be to accompany the student to town and to basically take care of the student while they were getting an education. That said, it was probably much easier for some ethnic groups to get education than others. For example, if you were a Roman living in Rome, there would certainly have been ample opportunity. If you were a Judean living maybe in Nazareth, there would have been fewer opportunities. That they probably would have been there, but they would have been far fewer. You wouldn't have been able to be as picky or choosy about who your teacher was going to be. So that's a good question.
And the second one, I read off the page that a student sent us. We have learned in our New Testament lessons that Jesus was very literate. So for example, he could speak Greek, and most of the people living in this area could speak Greek as well. How could this be possible when only 10 to 15% were skilled in literacy?
Yeah, well, so this is also an interesting question, and it raises points that go beyond literacy per se. So what we have talking about Jesus, you have questions of multilingualism. Jesus may have been able to read and write in Hebrew and or Aramaic. He may have spoken Greek and probably had to speak Greek, especially if he worked as a carpenter coming from the small village of Nazareth. He may very well have had to go to the larger city nearby of Sepphoris in order to get work in many cases. And in this case, he probably would have had to have known some Greek in order to get work and in order to communicate with some of the locals. We should think of this as related questions, but not identical questions. So the first question is, what languages did he speak? And many scholars agree with what you learned in New Testament class, that Jesus probably was multilingual. He probably spoke Aramaic, probably knew some Hebrew to some extent, and probably spoke some Greek. However, how much did he know how to read? The Gospels, different Gospels depict him as going into the synagogue and picking up a scroll and reading from the book of Isaiah. He does this in the Gospel of Luke. This would indicate a high level of literacy. John Crossan and other people have said that this may be a Lucan construction. Luke seems to be going to some efforts to try and boost the social and economic levels of some of the main characters relative to what we would otherwise think. Paul seems to be knocked up a notch or two in terms of his social and educational status, and it may be that Luke is doing the same thing with Jesus. That said, it is not at all unknown for craftsmen and their sons to have some lower levels of literacy, either at the primary or maybe at the secondary level. So depending on how much work Jesus's father was getting as a carpenter, he may have been able to afford to send Jesus to school before he started work. It's possible also that Jesus could have been educated the word is escaping me. Claudia will remember it. That when someone goes to learn a trade with another professional, right? This is called
a trade school.
A trade school. It's on one of my slides. I have to look back in a bit, but yeah. There were periods of training that you might learn a trade with someone who is a master craftsman. And if you needed to know reading and writing and some mathematics, then you would learn it at that point. So it wasn't only a matter of whether your father or family could afford it. So even though the literacy rate in general was low, it is not at all out of the question that Jesus and Paul could have had some basic levels of literacy, and I think it is probably likely that they both did have either a primary, maybe primary and secondary level of literacy. But then another question would be the question of education in the synagogue, which didn't presuppose literacy. Jesus could certainly have gone to synagogues and heard people reading the law and expounding about the law, interpreting the law in the synagogue every week. So he would have been able to have a fairly extensive knowledge of scriptural traditions without having to read scripture all the time.
Okay, thanks. Noch eine weitere Frage, another question. Were females educated the same as males by their tutors back then?
But were females educated in the same way?
The same as males.
The level of female education may have been lower than the level of male education. However, it was not uncommon for females to be educated. There was a difference, though, in terms of the level of education that we could expect. The females who were educated were typically coming from higher status groups, from aristocracy, or at least middling level families who could afford to send their daughters to school. They typically did not progress beyond the primary level, from what I've read. However, there were also some women philosophers who were known. Annette Heisinger has written about the women Pythagorean philosophers, so this may be something worth checking up on if you're interested. But typically, the most advanced education would go only to males who were being groomed for public life. And it was more the males who were meeting in the Senate and making the laws and doing the declamations in public more than females.
This answers the second question that another student just emailed us, but I'm going to ask the first question on the list. How many students on average studied with a single teacher during the Greek period?
Now that's how many students on average studied with a single Greek teacher. That I do not have information to be able to answer. The information that I have at hand is limited. I was reading just this morning an article by Greg Sterling, who is an expert on Philo of Alexandria, and he was arguing that Philo's school in Alexandria probably had from about 5 to about 15 students. This would imply a couple of things. He may have been able, since he was doing a very high level of education that was involving Greek philosophy, but also reading scriptural texts, he may have been able to charge on the higher end of the spectrum of what a student could be charged for instruction. But on the other hand, he was also coming from a wealthy family, so he may not have depended on that salary for his livelihood. But my guess, and this is only a guess, would be that would be more or less typical for some teachers. On the other hand, based on the numbers that I gave a few minutes ago about wages, you would need at least 30 students at the rate that the wage schedule from 301 CE stipulated. You would have to have at least 30 to be able to sort of make a middling level income. So I would imagine that in some places that teachers would definitely strive to have as many students as they could.
Okay. Nächste Frage, next question. From a scientific standpoint, are there any measurements or assessments possible regarding the quality of lectures, especially comparative between Greco-Roman and Jewish or early Christian education?
I would imagine certainly that the quality would have varied, and we do have some texts from antiquity in which students are discussing which teacher they should get. There is one text from a certain Nalos that was coming from Greco-Roman Egypt, and you can find this text in Raffaella Tribiore's book that is referenced in the bibliography at the end of this PowerPoint presentation. And in this text, the student is writing home to his father, and he is saying that the teachers that are available at the present moment, he says they are all terrible. The good teachers have left town looking for greener pastures, trying to find higher wages and more students. And what we're left with is all terrible, he says. So he tells his father, I am going to study with some of my friends who have a very good education. Maybe this is an excuse. I don't know. Maybe he wants to save the money that his father's sending him to spend on other things. I don't know. I was wondering about that as I was reading this. But he also says that he will continue his education by going to the public forum and listening to a famous speaker called Posidonius, who was active in Alexandria at that time. So if you lived in a big city, you could get good instruction in philosophy and in oratory simply by going to the public marketplace and listening to the famous speakers speak. And so again, this would be something that the opportunities would differ. If you were in a big city, like Paul in Tarsus, for example, we could expect him to have been able to listen to philosophers and very fine orators. But someone who is in a small town in one of the provinces in the Roman Empire would not have had those same kinds of opportunities. So again,
this would have been for free. Listening to them would have been for free.
Yes. So they would have contests at games like the Olympic Games. There would be contests in which not only plays would be performed, but also orators and philosophers would speak in contests. But then also just in the marketplace, the orators would speak. And for them, it was not only showing off their skills, but it was a way to attract students. And as we know, the more students you have, the more you get paid. So you go out in public and you show off your oratorical skills and hope that you'll get more money as a result of this, which means there was a form in a sort of way of public education for free, although quite different than it is today.
Thank you so much. Professor Kranemann hat mir das Zeichen gegeben, das internationale Zeichen für die Zeit ist um. Wir danken Ihnen, liebe Studierende, dass Sie heute dabei waren. Ich hoffe, Sie hatten Spaß. Ich glaube schon, dass wir einen Experten für das Lehren und Lernen hier herangeholt haben. Vielen Dank, dass Sie dabei waren. Thank you very much, Tom, for teaching us and for also giving us some fun in teaching and learning in your answers as well as in the pictures you showed us. Thanks so much, and we hope you have a wonderful day. Ours is over here in Germany.
Thank you so much, and thanks to Claudia and Benedict, and also to the students for your attention. Luckily that virtually it is impossible for me to remove my sandal and to strike anyone with it, and I appreciate your excellent questions.
No need for sandal striking. Thanks, Tom. Bye.
Bye.